All right, so thank you everyone for coming to our meeting today. If I could get everyone's attention real quick, we're gonna get started here. So first off, I'm gonna be passing around this little sign-in sheet. So if you're in the MDP class, fill this out. If you're not, you don't have to, but it would be nice just so we have an idea of how many people attended these meetings. I'm just gonna start here and just pass it around, sign it. So this is our second pre-production meeting, so let's get started. Okay. All right, so here is our agenda. First off, we're going to start with Alex Gissel here, our creative director, giving us a bit of story time, just kind of updates on where the narrative is going, where we're taking it, different level areas, stuff like that, what we're thinking of. Then we're going to get into announcing what the pods are for this semester. We're going to announce some of the pod leads and just talk about what each pod is going to be working on. Then we're going to just have some, I forgot to refresh this. Okay. Nico is going to talk a bit about what a vertical slice is before the pod announcements. Sorry, should have updated that. And then pod announcements. Then we'll have some final thoughts and reminders before we break off into department meetings. Some of the departments don't have as much to say as the others, so some of you might end up getting out of here earlier than others, and some of you might have to stay later. But yeah. So let's get started with story time.
Last week's meeting, I kind of gave you guys a very small breadcrumb of kind of like what we were thinking for the narrative and everything. And the goal of this meeting is kind of not to give you like the whole loaf, but kind of to give you maybe a few pieces of bread. So it'll be a lot more fleshed out, but there'll still be a long way to go. Before I get into it, there's this thing that we should cover really quick called Animatics, and this is important as some background info because it's going to be a way that we convey parts of the narrative. So some of our areas of the abyss, or like some parts of the game, won't necessarily have gameplay, or they'll have less gameplay, and it'll be kind of supplanted by these animatics to convey parts of the story. So I'll point out when that is the case. Here's an example. Austin Yarder was nice enough to send us something that he did. See, it's these images that convey some information, but it's not like a full-on animation. It's just a series of these kind of like painterly like things. It's really cool. I think that is, yeah. Hold on, my shoe is like untied. It came loose. I just didn't want to trip while I was up here. So getting into things, I kind of want to preface this as like, this will hopefully be very useful for artists and audio people to kind of get some inspiration for things. But on top of that, I'm hoping that this kind of gets people excited. This is something that we've been working really hard on. It's gone through a bunch of iterations already, a lot of like emotional grilling sessions that I've had to really like go deep and figure out what is kind of like the tone behind everything, like why am I making certain decisions in the story? And it really does come from like kind of a personal place. So this is a pretty intimate conversation. So I'm nervous to show you guys this, but it's very exciting. All right, so starting off with the setting, you'll see I actually got one of our best artists on the team, myself, to do some of the concept art for these areas to kind of give you an idea. We have the village, and as you all know, the village has these trees, and these trees provide this kind of life force to the village. So it creates this oasis of life in an otherwise barren wasteland. And yeah, like I said, there are people in the village, so we know that. It's a pretty small village. It's a tight-knit community. Everybody does something. Everybody earns their keep. And this is just kind of showing like, we don't have an exact concept for the village, of course, because this will depend a lot on concept art from our art team and everything. But the top depiction is like, I think Natasha had a really cool idea of like, the village is kind of supported by this big tree, and it's kind of like this treehouse village almost, hanging or supported above the abyss. And then there are ideas like, it's sloping down, and it's built into the cliffside or something like that. So a lot of ways we could take it, but just to give some idea. Key characters that we have right now. Io is the name of the main character. She is adolescent. She's sharp, adventurous, but otherwise unremarkable. And this is something that is pretty important to me. It kind of makes, when a character is, like this awesome warrior or this supernatural being and they have all these powers, inherently it makes that character a little bit less relatable to us. So this idea of making the character unremarkable is kind of like saying, this person's normal, just like all of us, but there's still this opportunity for something grand to happen. And yet there's this flaw. She's missing something in her life. She lives a normal life. She loves her village. She cares about the people in it. But just like everybody goes through this feeling sometimes, she feels like something's missing. And then there are the village leaders, and that's made up of the village elders and some of the adults in the village, and they're just responsible for taking care of some bigger decisions for the village. When big problems arise, like we'll see one will, they decide what to do next. So, getting into the conflict of the story, I think I mentioned this before, but the trees that support the village, that give this life to the village, are slowly dying. And so all the life is draining from the oasis. And that supports the village. They need this. The roots of the trees stretch deep down into the, is this the, I thought it was this laptop and I was just about to crash, but hopefully not. So the roots stretch deep down into the abyss. So it's kind of like the literal root of this problem is kind of like out of sight, out of mind. The abyss has always been forbidden for anybody to enter because it's so dangerous. Nobody's ever gone in and come back out. The village leaders have been downplaying this issue. They keep telling the village, it's not a big deal, things will be okay. And over time, this problem might solve itself. So getting into, that's some background info that you just kind of need to know. And getting into the chronological narrative here. Adventure awaits. So Io discovers the gravity of the situation. She listens in on this night meeting that the village leaders have, and she starts to glean some information that this problem is actually much bigger than the village leaders are making it out to be. They don't know what to do, and this could be hugely detrimental to the village. Some lore is that the village was nomadic before they came and settled down here, and they're starting to consider, maybe we need to leave again, find a new place. After listening in on this meeting, the leaders leave the room, and Io's left there, having concealed herself. And there's this prized heirloom of the village that's in this village elder's office. And she's seen it many times before. There's nothing crazy remarkable about it. It's just this bracelet that looks kind of weird, doesn't seem to really match the rest of the village. But she notices that after the elders leave the room, the bracelet is glowing. And she's never seen it glow before. So that's kind of weird. And against her better judgment, she tries it on. So, yeah, she steals it. Basically, when she tries on the bracelet, a weapon is immediately conjured in her hand. This sort of intricate-looking ethereal weapon. And intuition, this kind of new intuition that she's gained, like a voice in her head, almost tells her, try throwing the weapon. And she throws the weapon out the window, and bam, she instantly teleports to it. So she's gained this new strength, this really weird weapon, and a way to defend herself. And instantly this idea forms in her head. If the village leaders don't want to truly take care of this problem, she's going to do it herself. So this is kind of, in addition to her loving the village and the people in it and truly caring about them and wanting to solve this issue, more than anything, it's kind of an excuse for an adventure. That thing that's been missing her whole life, there's this escape right within her grasp. This is some art that I couldn't fit on the last slide. This is my depiction of that scene. Io's kind of sitting against the wall listening in on their conversation outside that room. I know, it's really good. So this, I should mention the village will probably largely be one of those animatic scenes because it's pretty much just exposition for the story. So there's not a huge need for a lot of gameplay, other than maybe the possibility of like a very basic tutorial, just like showing them the controls. Io gets comfortable with the weapon, and she makes a leap of faith. During that same night, she decides to approach the abyss, and she jumps into it. And it's a big jump. So basically, she jumps down, and she falls for a while. And then right before, when she sees the ground, right before hitting it, she throws her weapon up and teleports to it to stop her momentum. And she lands on the first solid ground in the abyss. And that kind of signifies that this is a leap of faith. It's a decision that is done. She's fallen significantly far into the abyss. This is something that she's going to do. So the abyss. It's not going to look like that. But in case you didn't know what an abyss looks like, it is a hole. The first area, this is not my art. We ripped this from the internet. Because we got to the crystal caves, and I was like, I can't draw this. So we just found a Google image. But this is the first area that Io encounters. And it's this large cavern of crystal deposits. And it's big, it's empty, and in the background, I can see these twinkling crystals far off in the distance. Then it kind of paints this picture of the night sky. And it's this really cool area that you would expect to see deep underground. And Io's really intrigued by it. On a technical level, this is kind of like our standard representative of our game area. It's going to have combat. It's going to have platforming. And this is kind of what we see as like, yeah, the most representative of our game. And we'll talk about a vertical slice later. It'll explain more of that. Here, Io encounters the first enemy, which we are calling abyssals. And these enemies are kind of these animalistic creatures that are devoid of any humanity. And Io is not aware of their background. But I can tell you it right now because it might be cool for us to know. And their background is basically, like Io, people have gone into the abyss before. And the abyss kind of forces you to face these inner conflicts. And not everybody beats that inner conflict. And what happens when that occurs is that the abyss turns you into one of these abyssals. So these are people that have been here before and have been overcome by the abyss. Physiologically, I won't go too deep into it, but something important is that they don't have eyes. They can't see. The way they sense things is through heat. So they're kind of always attracted to Io as a human that gives off heat. But they don't give off any heat themselves. And the significance of that is that they live this extremely lonely existence where they can't really interact with each other. They can't even see each other. And they don't have eyes, so they can't really see the wonders of the abyss, the thing that kind of kept them there. So I know that's kind of depressing, but it's supposed to be. And they've lost all of their humanity. And then at the end of the crystal caves, Io encounters the first boss, the first big challenge. And we don't have, we're working on this, so we don't have super big details for this right now. But keep in mind, this is just a big challenge that Io overcomes. And it's difficult, but she feels good after. She feels like she's doing something. She's doing that thing that was missing. And she, like I said before, she's very intrigued by this point. Because this area is just very wondrous, these crystals forming the night sky in the background. After that, she encounters the windmill fort. And this is very contrasting to the crystal caves because it's pure evidence that people existed here in the abyss. And that in itself is also extremely intriguing to Io. People have done this before. It's this large man-made wooden installation in the abyss, covered in windmills, like the name implies. And there's also this grate at the bottom. And there's a lever that's supposed to open the grate, but Io tries it and it doesn't work. And she remarks that some of the windmills around the fort seem to be stuck. So her hypothesis is if I unstuck these windmills, then the lever will work. So that's kind of important just from like a technical standpoint. This is an idea where we thought we could really kind of break up the linearity of the gameplay and kind of have this mini objective for Io. And narratively, there's this strong downdraft coming from above because the bottom of the abyss is a different temperature than the top of the abyss. And wind kind of flows through the windmills, and that's what's keeping them turning. Yeah, Io is still intrigued. And then this is my favorite one so far. My favorite art. It kind of looks like cheese, but it's not. It's supposed to be like, that's a stone. I should say, like, these concepts, like, these are not very useful to anybody, probably. I just thought there should be pictures in the presentation to kind of paint a very basic picture. And so it's this big stone structure that's riddled with holes. And that's why it's called the honeycomb. It kind of looks like a honeycomb. And because it's a very tunnely area, it's much more claustrophobic in contrast with the rest of the abyss. So, and it's kind of nest-like. There's a lot of abyssals here, and combat can be really intense. So it's a very, you're kind of in the belly of the beast here. Oh, and like I said, that downdraft that was above blowing through the windmills is now passing through this honeycomb-like structure. And maybe it's making these interesting noises. I'm just imagining Faulkner with like a line of empty beer bottles, just like blowing on them. Because I know he'll come up with an interesting way, the whole audio team will, to do these things. And Io encounters the second boss here. This is where, the second big challenge. And these bosses, these are big things. Think like old school arcade style bosses where, back before they could make full sprites for the bosses, they would just make them part of the background. That's like, they're big in scale. So they're these scary challenges for Io. And now you can tell I was a bit more compelled to draw. I shouldn't say that looks detailed, but in comparison to the cheese, I think it's a little bit better. The floating fields is kind of this area of a breather for Io. She's overcome these really intense challenges at this point, and she's become more and more intrigued by the abyss because there's so many things down here that she didn't think were down here. It's this collection of kind of floating islands, and there's nothing of significance on them other than just like grass and flowers, something that you would see on the surface. And this is an area where the downdraft has now kind of died out into a slight breeze. And I had this idea that this is the area where kind of the cold air from the bottom of the abyss and the hot air from the top, or vice versa, I don't know science, but it's mixing and creating this kind of brackish mixture of air. And because it's this brackish mixture of like temperature, it's difficult for the abyssals to even see here. So the floating fields are kind of hidden from view from the abyssals, so they don't really come around here. It's a very peaceful area. And this allows Io to kind of catch her breath a little bit, take a breather, and for a brief moment, she kind of stands there and thinks to herself, like, this place is nice. And this is kind of the escape that I didn't realize I wanted for a long time in my life. And she kind of has this twinge like, what if I just stayed here? Maybe this conflict isn't as pressing as I had previously thought. Maybe I can afford to do this. But she presses on nonetheless. She gets to the abandoned city, which is an area that we've talked about for a while now. And this is kind of this area of mystery, right? It's a large lake with these tall concrete metal towers sticking out of it. And this is where you encounter the final boss. And the final boss is, in contrast with the earlier bosses, someone that is approximately Io's size, and they seem to be human. And even though Io has taken down these big monsters already and these animalistic creatures, she gets here, and this thing that's way smaller is somehow way more threatening to her. So this is going to be a cool, intense final boss. Oh, and it also, I forgot to mention this, it also seems to have similar powers to Io. It can teleport around and conjures this weapon. But importantly, they seem to do it better. And then this is an area that'll also probably be pretty much entirely animatic, if we can include it in the scope. This is where the ending kind of happens. It's this advanced city that seems like a whole nother world. And they seem to have this deeper understanding of the trees and their power because the roots have been going all the way down until this point. And they seem to make better use of it. And they welcome Io, and they offer her a place to stay. But they recognize that Io's begun to fall victim to the same thing that all of the Abyssals have fallen victim to. So I might be getting a little too deep here, but basically, she's taken care of the external conflict. But the advanced city recognizes that she hasn't really defeated the internal conflict. And they recognize that it's something that somebody has to do themselves to not really fall victim to the abyss. So they recognize that she should probably go back home, but they aren't sure if she would make it at this point. The resolution is that Io does overcome it. She realizes, I had these feelings of like, maybe I should stay here, and this isn't an escape. But this escape isn't really fulfilling. She recognizes that it probably wouldn't be fulfilling to her. She does really care about the village back home, and she remembers what she came here for, and she remembers the good things about the village, that people did care for her. So she resists the pull of the abyss, and she makes it back home. She goes all the way back up, and she returns to find that the village has been abandoned. They presumably took one of the other routes and became nomadic again. And she's been gone for a while, so. Finn. Yeah. So this is obviously kind of depressing. Yeah. Questions?
If you want.
Yeah. Obviously pretty depressing. Sorry about that. But it's, we'll figure it out as we're going. Does anybody have any questions? I will preface this with suggestions are great. If you have a suggestion, please DM it to me on Discord, just because otherwise I will probably forget. Or, I just want to be able to handle things case by case and really, give a good response. Yeah, Rob.
So is it all abyssals all the way? Is everything you fight supposed to be an abyssal, or are there more basic, less threatening enemies early on?
So the current plan is that everything besides the Guardian, the last boss at the end, is an abyssal.
Okay.
And that's not to say everything looks exactly the same.
Right.
That's more to say there's a common theme that is going to tie things together for consistency. So kind of think a good example of a game that does this is Kingdom Hearts. They have the Heartless that all kind of they look related, you can tell, but they do a ton of really creative, imaginative things with them. So yeah, just for consistency, essentially. Yeah. Sorry? Yeah, sure. So there's a lot of lore that we could have for this game. And the fact of the matter is that we probably won't be able to explain a lot of that to the player just because of scoping reasons and stuff. There's probably a lot of stuff that I know and I don't mention just because of I just assume people know things that I know, which is obviously if I don't communicate them, that's not true. But I'll be fleshing things out, and hopefully, I think the Confluence will be up within the next couple to several days, and on there will essentially be a full fleshed out explanation of all this, and then there will hopefully be links that you can click to that'll give more background on things. So there'll be a full page of description for the origin of the Abyssals, and maybe there'll be lore for how did the Honeycomb structure form, or who were these people that were in the Abyss before, because there are answers for that. It's just something that I decided was probably too deep to go into today. Yeah.
For the level you described for the living islands,
Yeah.
living places, you said that like she's kind of compelled to stay. Is there like a underlying narrative that like it's kind of like hypnotizing to like people who come in and like previous people who came in, or is it just like something like is it kind of like the land is doing that to her?
Mm-hmm.
Is that kind of supposed to be coming from like an internal development?
Yeah, so I think it's a little bit of both. The abyss kind of forces you to go through something like this. And it might be different from person to person based on something that they're dealing with inside. And for Io, because she's always been looking for this escape, it kind of manifests in this, wow, this place is cool. What if I stayed here? But it might be different for another person. But I would definitely say there's something to the abyss that kind of is a little supernatural, maybe, making something like this happen. Yeah.
So what was like the original conflict like? Why did the village always like conflict? What was the actual problem?
The problem is that the trees that provide life to the village are dying out. And their roots go all the way deep down into the abyss. And without the trees, they wouldn't be able to like grow food. They wouldn't have water. They couldn't have like livestock, because the village is kind of like this oasis in this barren area.
I like it resolving it.
What's that?
I like it resolving it.
Oh yeah, that's something I forgot to mention. When she gets to the advanced city, they kind of explain to her that the abyss is kind of like this pathway between these two villages. And it's kind of a pathway like similar to a pathway through a patch of grass, like a dirt pathway. If somebody doesn't use it for a long time, nature starts to reclaim it. And the abyss has been empty for a long time. And they explain that, you know, if nobody's using it, the abyss will start to essentially close. And since the roots go through it, that'll kind of choke off the life in the trees. And they explain that basically even her single trip will have probably started to reverse the process. So that's kind of the external conflict with a bow on it, saying, you have solved this, but there's something else that you need to solve too. Yeah.
You showed the pixel arty picture on the slides.
Yes.
Art style that the game's gonna be like.
No, actually. So this is mostly for technical reasons and like logistical reasons, but also for good reason. Like those are good reasons. But we'll be doing pretty much the same exact art style as Dreamwillow was. This vectorized art with skeletal animation, and that's partially because it's a process that we know that we can teach people. We already have tutorials for it. George and Amber can probably talk a bit more about it than I can, but it's also a really pretty art style. So. And it's also a great way of managing consistency. Like if we do like pixel art, A, it becomes a lot of work, especially for people that are not familiar with it. And B, it's hard to maintain that consistency amongst a lot of artists. Oh, yeah. So in addition to like the vectorized art, what we're planning on doing is the backgrounds will be kind of this painterly style, which will be really cool and maybe provide a bit more detail. And to handle the consistency problems of that, we'll probably only have like very few artists working on that at a time. Yes?
How will the narrative be exposed? You mentioned the animatics, but would those be something like a flashback, or the character would find an item that would just reveal that?
Yeah, this is something that'll probably largely be determined due to scope. The animatics are kind of our base idea for telling the exposition and the ending, but obviously there's a lot in between. We've thrown around the idea of like if we can do as much environmental storytelling as possible. That's probably the lowest resource cost way of doing things, but there's still a lot of thought on that, and it'll really just be dependent on how much time we have. Kind of probably something that we do is more of like. The narrative should essentially serve as a point of inspiration for making certain decisions, secondary to gameplay, but it's mostly for us. I would love to tell the entirety of the story in like a very fleshed out manner, of course, but we might have to, the scoping will probably just be how much can we tell of this story. So we'll probably have a dialogue system, but you know, just managing expectations, you know, nothing is set in stone yet. Stuff we're trying to do, yeah. Yep. Probably not. I mean, this will be something, for things like this is kind of like a puzzly situation, right? It requires a lot of playtesting. So if we start playtesting it and people are confused as to what to do, that's not what we want. And we definitely want the game to also lean on the more accessible side as well. So you can imagine, like, if we wanted to just hand it to them, basically, IO might make a comment saying, oh, these windmills look stuck. Maybe that'll change something or something like that. But yeah, we'll play test it and we'll make sure that it's, you know, appropriate. Yeah, Alex.
Are we thinking of like voicing the characters at all, or just like animatics?
It'll just be Animatics. Yeah, no plans for any voice acting. All right. Thanks so much, everybody.
Cool. So obviously the scope is going to be extremely important. We need to make sure we actually finish the game. And when Alex was talking about that, it may have seemed like there was like a lot of different zones, right? And that this is a huge game. And we totally agree. We're not necessarily planning to be able to do everything here. We still think it's valuable no matter what, because particularly for the art and the audio teams, we think that having an understanding of what's going on with the story can help inform a lot of the decisions you make. But so I want to talk a little bit. Bam, there it is. Okay, so I want to talk a little bit about what like the production roadmap is going to look like in regards to what our expectations are. You know, like I don't know if whenever people applied to college, sometimes they were like these like was it my fallbacks, like the ones I think I'll get, and then like my stretch, you know, colleges or whatever, right? And in a similar way, that's how we're thinking about the zones and the different parts of the game that we're going to try and implement and actually have. So maybe I should have explained vertical slice first, but I'm about to in a second, so it's not a big deal. For what I'm going to explain is the vertical slice. It's just going to contain the village and the crystal caves. Vertical slice is very important. I'm going to explain it in about 30 seconds, so you know, hold on. The baseline expectation, we're like, you know, we definitely think we can get this in the game. It's what we're going to plan on being the game in the final, is village, crystal caves, and the floating fields. There's a lot of reasons for why we chose this ordering and why we thought certain zones were maybe more important than others, or pacing. I can get into that if people have questions after this. But you know, we'll probably document this somewhere once everyone's invited to the Confluence, which, like Alex said, will probably be in the next 2 to 3 days. And then ideally, like kind of, if we have a little bit more time, we'll try and work in the windmill fort because it's another gameplay area. Stretch goals, the Honeycomb and the Advanced City. Something to mention, Alex mentioned it a little bit, but I just want to reiterate, is that the current understanding, wait, there's something, Abandoned City's not here, awkward. Did we even, we'll figure it out. This is roughly what we're doing. Abandoned City is probably going to be in the ideal or stretch goals, but more info on that later when we actually document this in the Confluence. But, so this is the general idea. We know that it's a big game. We're not going to try and do it all once and then maybe end without having a game that's complete. So what's critical for that is a vertical slice. So maybe I'll just explain like this. So a game has multiple components, right? We have like each of the zones of this game. There might be some kind of combat that we have to balance and implement. There's different kinds of enemies. There's the animatics that we've talked about. And then there's the UI, narrative, a lot of different components of a game, right? There's a lot of different aspects of each of those, right? There's a ton of different kinds of enemies. There's a ton of possible animatics, et cetera. The point of a vertical slice is that you take a small portion of each of these and have it implemented in some kind of build or some kind of, you know, milestone. This is valuable because it means that, oh, I didn't do the little bullet point by bullet point here. It's a small but complete representation of the game. So that means not only like does it exist, but ideally it has like final art and final audio. The point of this is that you can have an understanding of how long each of these things take to make, right? If it takes like 3 weeks to make a single enemy, we probably can't do like 3 enemies for every zone, right? And same with basically every aspect of the game. How long does it take to design, create, iterate, balance, polish, etc.? That's why it has to be final, or ideally anyways, it's a final asset. Because then, once you have that, you can say, okay, this took me this long. You project it into the future and you say, are we on schedule, right? Do we actually have time to finish this game? And that's when the ideal and the stretch goals might come into play. Maybe we have time, maybe we don't, we'll figure it out. And of course, once that kind of is finished and we've made that assessment, we'll relay it to everyone. We'll have an idea continuously of what the plan is. To explain the vertical slice a little bit more, I'm going to talk about an E3 demo. So this is a very niche game. Many of you might not have heard of it. I've heard of it. I haven't played it. It's called God of War. So yeah, obviously I love this game. Many of you may have already known about this game, played this game. Has anyone is anyone totally unfamiliar with this game? Raise your hand high. Oh, I'm so ashamed of you. Okay, so essentially God of War is a third-person action game where you are a god of war, who would have thought? Not Ares, but it's a long story. And you're traveling through the Norse land of Midgard with your son to spread the ashes of your late wife. There's a lot of killing and fighting and stuff in between that. Great game, would recommend. But the way that they did their E3 demo was this. So it had some intro cinematic, right? There's like it was like the reveal of Kratos, the main character. Everyone like lost their minds. Then after that, there's like some mild exploration. There's really beautiful like scenery, so you could sit there and admire it. Then they have a narrative moment between the son and the father, because that's a core part of the story. It's a very narrative-heavy game. There's a lot of combat. In the end, there's a boss fight. That boss fight includes one of the kind of special attacks that your player can do. It had your son, Atreus, like assisting you in combat, which is very common. And then it had like a finisher move, right? The E3 demo itself was only like 10 minutes long. And of course, it's also like an 80-hour game, so that's not how long ours are going to be. Yeah, but the nice thing is, it showed you what the entire game more or less would look like, right? You could watch the E3 demo and be like, I know what this game is, and be able to determine if you want to buy it or not, right? So that's not necessarily our goals for the vertical slice, but it is maybe more to contextualize to you what we want the vertical slice to look like. Because whenever you see an E3 demo or a demo of a game, a lot of times it looks like exactly how the game looks whenever it comes out, right? Even though the demo might have come out like 2 years before or something like that. So that's the point of it, is to have those final assets, know what the game is, as well as how long it takes to make different items or assets, whatever, and then be able to project that into the future. Is that it? Yes. Does anyone have any questions regarding production timeline or anything I've said? What?
Do we have like a final due date, or is it just sort of like?
April 21st, 6 to 10 p.m. is the EEX 494 showcase. That's where this game will be shown off and like is the final requirement. I guess the Sunday before then is like the final due date. And we've talked a little bit about project schedule. I'm actually glad you asked that, because I forgot to mention something else. This vertical slice, and if any of you remember like the initial timeline we talked about, was not included. It wasn't until we saw like how big the game was and we had to downscope it and sequence it that we determined that the vertical slice was necessary. So at the kickoff meeting next Sunday, or the Sunday after this one, we're going to give you probably a much more detailed and much more in-depth timeline. We won't necessarily walk through it, because I don't want to put everyone through that, but we will make it available on the Confluence and then give you a rough idea of what the bigger milestones are, how much time you have for them, what the expectations are, et cetera. Good question. Yeah, answer. Any other questions? Okay, cool. I'm going to let George talk about the rest, like pods.
So I'm going to talk a bit about what our pods are for this game. I hope everyone remembers what pods were. It's kind of like a team that works on a specific feature of the game. So our pods for this semester are UI, enemies, level design, animatics, player, bosses, VFX, and tools. And I'll get into what each of these are in a second. So user interface. So the user interface pod is in charge of showing different information to the player. This might be like what their health is right now, how much currency they have. If there was like a leveling system, it would be how much experience they need to get to the next level. It would also be in charge of making dialogue boxes, different menus like the pause menu or the main menu, the title screen, a game over screen, stuff like that is what the user interface pod is in charge of. So now I'm going to announce the pod lead. Matt, yes. Is that right?
Wait,
No.
that's incorrect.
That is incorrect.
Oh, no.
Okay. Sorry. This was wrong. This was wrong. Yeah. So actually, the pod lead is Kavya. So, yes, Kavya, pod lead. Hello. Raise your hand. Yes. All right. So, yeah, sorry about that. I was a bit confused there. Okay. Well. All right, so next up is the enemies pod. So the enemies pod is in charge of the visual and audio design of what our enemies look like, so what these abysmals will look like in each zone, for instance. They're also in charge of the behavior of each enemy. That would be more on what the designers are doing, and then also balancing the enemies. So like how much health they should have, how much damage, how fast they should move, things like that. And the pod lead here is Rob Swarth. All right, next up is level design. So the level design pod is in charge of level creation, level-specific mechanics. So this might be like an airstream in like the Honeycomb level that like pushes the player up in the air or something like that. Or the different windmills that you have to fix in the windmill fort level, things like that. They're also in charge of transitions from one level to another. So one thing that we were talking about doing, not entirely sure for managing expectations here, but we were discussing perhaps having a short animatic that plays when the player transitions from one level to another. So the level design pod would be in charge of designing the audio for that, designing what that animatic might look like, yeah, stuff like that. All right, and the pod leads here are both Gino and Matt. All right, next up, animatics. So we covered these a little before, and we showed a video example of what an animatic is. So animatics are basically like storyboards, single painted frame kind of thing, or like frame by frame, telling us a quick little story, and it's more narrative focused. So this would probably be a mainly art-based pod. We might have one or two programmers in charge of just loading up that specific file, or the animatic, and playing through it. We might have like an audio person who does the audio for the animatic, stuff like that. Probably no need for designer, but we'll see. Kind of depends on where things go with this. And the pod lead here is Rachel Liu. All right, next up is bosses. So the boss pod is in charge of designing boss mechanics, designing boss arenas, and boss aesthetics. So, yes, and our pod lead here is Gino. All right, so VFX. So the VFX pod is in charge of creating particle systems, shaders, stuff like that. So this could be like when the player jumps, like if and they land, maybe a puff of smoke appears off of them or something like that. And the VFX pod really works for other pods to just make sure that any VFX work they need is like being consistent throughout the game. Like they'll just work on all of the VFX throughout. So if like the user interface wants a particle to pop out when the player hits a button, the VFX pod would be in charge of that. Yeah. Moving on to the player pod. So the player pod is in charge of player movement, player. Oh.
You mentioned that we're still working on the pod.
Yes. So for VFX, we're still working on the pod lead, and we will announce that later. All right. So for the player pod, they're in charge of player movement, so the running, jumping, stuff like that, how that should all feel, what like the animations look like, things like that, how high, yada yada, as well as player combat, so the player's attacks, like how much damage they deal, programming that, yada yada. They're also in charge of any items. Now, this isn't necessarily something that's going to be in the game because we haven't designed anything here yet, but if we were to decide that we want an item system like health potions or anything like that, or player upgrades, things like that, the player pod would be in charge of that, and the player pod would also be in charge of a save system if we decide to do that. That really depends on how much of the game we decide is in scope. If a large portion of it is, we'll probably need a save system, but probably this won't be something we'll be doing for the vertical slice. All right, and the pod lead here is Matt Rader. All right, so this is an interest form. I'm going to leave this up for a few minutes for people to just open up the link. So go ahead and fill this out if just mark down how interested you are in each pod. And yeah, also if anyone has any questions, I'll take those now. Oh, did I thought we made a tools one. Okay, well yeah, we are also having a tools pod that's kind of in charge of any extra programming things I guess we need, like, Nico, do you want to talk a bit more about this?
So the tools pod would, if anyone's familiar with the idea of like Unity editor scripting, essentially that's the kinds of things the tools pod would cover. Also things like analytics. So it's really useful, for instance, for level designers to be able to know, how long did it take a player to go through this level? How many times did they die? Where did they die? Did they explore this part of the level? And there's a lot of really interesting ways that you can capture that information using Unity and using editor scripting or maybe other methods, but that's the main one that comes to mind. Basically, it's any kind of editor scripts or analytics, things that are kind of mostly useful for the team as opposed to being final assets or things that would be in the game deliverable, if that makes sense.
Not a question about tools pod, but just curious, can we think a little bit about what pods we might be interested in and submit later today?
Oh yeah, of course. This interest form will be posted in the Discord later, and you're also able to edit your submissions if you decide that you don't want to be in whatever pod you said you were interested in before. Any other questions?
Can people be in multiple pods, or is it just one pod per person?
We're going to try and stick to probably. So if you're in a larger pod, like enemies or level design or player, something like that, then there's a lot of work to do, and that requires a lot of coordination within the pod, right? So that's probably, you would only be in that pod. Now, if you're in a pod like VFX or tools or UI, those are things that might require, you might want more work than that pod has to give you. In which case, we could put you into two pods. The way that we're going to go about doing this pod membership is mostly looking at how you all react and fill out this form, and then kind of creating a rough outline, making sure it looks good in regards to how spread out skill is, and experience, interest, commitment, availability, things like that. Once we have that idea, we'll be sending that out. If anyone we'll send out essentially what we think the best pod organization and pod membership structures are. And if people have large disagreements or I really don't want to be in this pod, I really prefer this one, then we'll work with you. It'll much more be like a case-by-case basis in regards to being in multiple pods. And we'll try and work with you if we can.
Was there a reason for there not being a narrative pod?
Yeah, the reason that we don't have a narrative pod is mainly because that has shifted to being a responsibility of our creative director to kind of oversee the narrative. And different pods might try and, Alex might work with the level design pod to add environmental storytelling throughout a level, right? But it wouldn't be a responsibility of a narrative pod. That would be on Alex as creative director.
Does the level design pod include building the backgrounds and building the world textures and stuff like that for each level? Or?
Yes.
Okay.
Any other questions? Yes. Yes, that would be a responsibility of the player pod. Any other questions? No one? Going once? Going twice? All right. Sure.
I want to have a big asterisk here, and this is something that we have not spoken about a lot, so I might be one-sided, but don't worry about it. I could see a potential for if we decide that like we have a lot of time and you know somehow this game is not large enough, which I doubt it's going to happen. But you know, animatics don't take nearly as long as we think, and we want to convey more of the story. I can foresee a potential possibility of having people who are interested in telling a narrative working with Alex or something to be able to just fill out that fill in that information, right? Like if there are enough facets to the story, then it could potentially be something that Alex is interested in, or rather doesn't have the time to do all of it, in which case we could have, I'm not sure I'd say a narrative pod, but like people, you know, sure, a narrative pod. I'm not going to be getting into specifics right now. But I want to say that with a big asterisk. It's something that I kind of haven't talked to any of them about, and I literally thought about when that question was asked. But it's something that I don't want to say is completely impossible.
Any last questions, comments, concerns? All right, so moving on. Just going to give a couple of final thoughts. Reminder, please check Discord frequently. We have like 90 people in the Discord server, but only like 40 or 50 people reacted to the announcement this morning. So people could please make sure to get on that, reacting to the different messages, checking when you're pinged, turning on your notification settings, stuff like that. We'll be sending out Atlassian invites sometime within the next week. So this will be for our Confluence, which is our documentation site, our Bitbucket, which is our Git repository, and for our Jira, which is for task management. Reminder, these meetings are here. Now that's incorrect, no longer in 1690. We have moved to this room for more space, and we are meeting at 2 p.m. to 4 p.m. Reminder, on Mondays, WolverineSoft has casual workspace meetings, and those have already started. So tomorrow, if you want to come in at 7 p.m., we'll be in 2150 DAO, just kind of casually hanging out and working on things. So if you don't know how to do something, you kind of want to help, that might be a good time to come in and try and learn from us. If you have any questions about any of this, send me a message on Discord or email the studio email account there. And finally, we're going to break off into different department meetings. So department leads, if you could stand up and kind of corral your different teams in different directions.